Listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
State funeral for Queen Elizabeth II ushers in the end of an era. This is according to the Washington Post. Monday, today, finally marks the end of the second Elizabethan age. Westminster Abbey's tenor bell tolled 96 times, once for each year of her life, before her coffin was carried for the state funeral. Behind it, her eldest son, Charles III, who's 73, taking the reins of the kingdom. Here's my question. The optics tell us it's the end of an era, but with Charles at the helm of the firm, I think it's business as usual. For insight into this, let's turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moores Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery, Jim Crow, and the Roots of American Fascism. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, sir, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
So let's put the pomp and the circumstance behind us. I know that the optics serve a purpose, perpetuating a narrative and an image, but these folks are worth close to $1 trillion. So, we can talk about the end of the Elizabethan age from a social, perspective, or from an optics perspective, the matronly, nice old lady walking around patting people on their heads. But in terms of the politics and in terms of the economic realities of the firm, it's business as usual.
I think that's a fair point. And in fact, you may have invited the wrong guest on, because you would have been better off inviting on a parasitologist, that is to say, a scientist who studies parasites. Because this blood-sucking family in London deserves no commendation, to put it mildly. In fact, it reminds me of the comment by the late Moms Mabley. I'm sure you recall her.
I do.
The comic who was notorious for saying, "My daddy told me if somebody dies, if you can't say anything good about them, don't say nothing." So she would say, Queen Elizabeth died, good. So I would say that this pomp and circumstance in London was an insult to all of the victims of the British Empire. I hear their voices still moaning and groaning from the graves. Think about it, for example. When so-called Queen Elizabeth ascends to the throne, one of the first acts of Her Majesty's government is to send a flotilla to then British Guyana, now Guyana, the only English-speaking state in North America, to dislodge the left-leaning regime of Chetty Jagan, and then stir up antagonism, which is bedeviling that nation to this very day, between those of African descent and those of South Asian descent. Of course, I'm sure your audience is familiar with the so-called Mau Mau revolt and the state of emergency implanted during her reign in Kenya, East Africa. And by the way, as I noted in my book on Kenya, U.S. nationals, particularly Euro-Americans, were working cheek by jowl with Her Majesty's Armed Forces in Kenya in terms of repressing and suppressing that African revolt. And then to exemplify the point that they were a kind of equal opportunity oppressors, recall what happened in 1975 in Australia, when Her Majesty's Governor General collaborated with U.S. imperialism. The Governor General, of course, is the Crown's representative in these states that still hold her dear as head of state. Canada, Jamaica, for example, and of course Australia. And so the Governor General conspires with U.S. imperialism to dislodge the left-leaning government of Gough Whitlam of the Labor Party. And of course, that was so notorious, it was portrayed in the Hollywood blockbuster, The Falcon and the Snowman, starring Sean Penn. And lest we forget, there was the overthrow of the left-leaning government in Grenada, the tiny island in the Caribbean comprised mostly of people of African descent. Once again, it was the Governor General the Crown's representative in Grenada, who conspired with the regime of Reagan in Washington to assemble a U.S. invasion force to the point that even Margaret Thatcher, who was supposedly one of Mr. Reagan's closest allies, Margaret Thatcher objected because basically the U.S. went behind her back to collaborate with a representative of the Crown. And I think that exposes and reveals why it is that this ceremony, so-called in London this morning, is receiving so much attention on this side of the Atlantic. You'd never know that supposedly this government was born in 1776 in a revolt against the Crown. But I think what it really reveals is that this so-called revolt against the Crown in 1776 basically was not the sort of revolution that many have been taught to believe, in which you will be reprimanded, rebuked, if not worse, if you contend otherwise. It was basically a counter-revolution based upon narrow interests of the governing class that emerged in North America, designed to further loot the Native Americans and further enslave the Africans. And let's not even talk about Prince Philip, the man who predeceased Her Majesty. This was a man of Greek origin, which means that King Charles III, as he is now being called, is half Greek. And of course, this kind of intermarriage between and amongst royal families was meant to solidify a certain iteration of whiteness and white supremacy, although I don't think that Prince Philip was her cousin, because that was quite notorious for the royal families to engage in incest, which then led to physical and mental deformations. But on second thought, I'm not sure if King Charles III is all there. So perhaps he is a product of that kind of deformation. But in any case, Prince Philip was notorious for his racist comments. And I won't insult your audience by sounding off on his many blunders and malaprops over the years, but you can easily find them online.
Wow. I did want to ask you about this. It's interesting that the Queen died now, particularly two things. We've got some of the Caribbean islands and some places around the world saying we no longer want to be under the monarchy. And at a time when I think this is big, the SCO meeting last week, when the UK, the US empire, that Anglo-Saxon empire that has controlled money, that has controlled the economic system and used that coercively. And now we see this gigantic, monstrous economic system being born that seems to be, in my opinion, set to eventually overtake it. Your thoughts on all of that at this particular time when the Queen dies?
Well, it is ironic, if not poetically appropriate, that Her Majesty kicked the bucket as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization was meeting in Central Asia, inaugurating a new world order, a world order that will eclipse the one set by the Crown in the 1500s, and fortunately coming to a screeching halt. I think it's also striking, is it not, that you had all of the U.S. major media devoting really just an extraordinary amount of time to this parasite expiring, despite the fact that a good deal of their audience is not interested in this hoopla. And it seems that they have this assignment to continue to throw dust in the eyes of their audiences, whether or not their audiences are evading and eluding that dust that is directed at them. And so it seems that not far behind in terms of the expiration of Queen Elizabeth is what Bob Iger, the former chairman and CEO of Disney, called the death of linear television. He sees that cable networks and other networks on television have one foot on a banana peel. They're headed for the dustbin of history. And certainly by giving all of this airtime to this death of this parasite helps to validate what Bob Iger has been contending.
I find it interesting. It's being reported that Harry and Meghan were snubbed in the seating arrangements. They were put in the second row, where they even had to sit behind Prince Andrew, who was stripped of his duties due to his relationship with convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. So I guess Meghan had to sit in the back of the bus, figuratively, as it relates to the seating at Westminster Abbey. But would like to really get, in a couple minutes we have left, this whole imagery of the end of the second Elizabethan age. What does that mean to you? Because as I said in the open, the so-called royal family is often called the firm. This is a business empire. And so this whole Elizabethan age, your thoughts?
Not only is it a business empire, but we, those of us of African descent who are sitting in North America, speaking a language developed in Northwestern Europe, should take this all very seriously. Because the first Elizabethan age, so-called, in the late 1500s with the first Queen Elizabeth, meant the inauguration of, or I should say the acceleration of the unlimited African slave trade. That is what distinguished the first Elizabethan age. That is one of the reasons why there's so many black people walking the streets of Washington, D.C. as we speak. And for those who have a heart and a conscience, and I know that that probably reduces the cohort tremendously by adding that qualifier, they all should be up in arms about the time devoted to the death of this so-called queen, because they visited misery to countless numbers all over the world. They're sitting on a major fortune, as you suggested, most of which was plundered from the Americas, from Africa, from Asia. And if there's any justice, we will seize the opportunity to make reparations the order and the cry of the day, relieving King Charles III of some of that misbegotten wealth that he now sits on.
In fact, I believe on top of, I saw a picture of on top of the casket, and there's the, the regal purple pillow or whatever, and sitting on top of that
is that
was
crown.
That crown with the Star of Africa in it. Dr. Horne.
1 minute.
There are just so many jewels that have been looted from South Africa in particular. And South Africa is a middle-ranking power. It has heft. It's part of the BRICS. I would urge and encourage our friends in South Africa to raise through the BRICS, to get them to raise with London the pressing issue of returning of that looted and plundered wealth to South Africa as a prelude to a massive program of reparations, not only to African nations plundered by the slave trade, but to the children of Africa now languishing on these shores of North America.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.
Thank you.